Hey all, Zach Lokes. Here's a video about crop rotation. Crop rotation is a really important concept for home growers and market gardeners. Anyone who is in the process of growing vegetables and wants to grow them into the long term will want to understand crop rotation. With crop rotation, you are helping to mitigate the buildup of issues that come from growing the same crop in the same location all the time, namely disease and pests that might build up. But at the same time, you want to take into account other considerations like fertility needs so that you're balancing heavy feeders and light feeders, crops that require a lot of fertility like squash with crops that have limited fertility needs, examples being things like lettuce. When you do this, this allows you to balance out the fertility inputs throughout your entire garden plot. And it also allows you to allow your crops to help add fertility through creating compost in your garden beds using the debris left over by crops, which is in itself another reason to have a crop rotation, because some crops are heavy debris creators. They leave a lot of debris in the field, and others don't leave very much debris at all. And so you want crops that work with each other over time so that you don't have to manage so much debris in order to make the crop bed adequate for the crop that follows a heavy debris crop. So these are all a bunch of reasons for why we have a crop rotation. Overall, crop rotation is a fairly simple concept in its basics. You have a bed here. For instance, this bed is say 15 feet, but it could be up to 100 feet or more, and say 48 inches wide. That's a standard, perma bed with 30-inch bed top and, a decent sized shoulder and a path. It's usually about 12 inches up for the path. So if you have a crop in this bed like lettuce, in bed number one, you might have 12 beds, 1 through 12. And in year one, this crop number one occupies bed number one. So crop number one occupies the bed in year one. And then in year two, it goes off here towards another bed. So after being planted in this garden bed, the lettuce will be grown in another bed, and another crop like crop number two will come into this bed. And this will be followed by crop number three. So in year two, this bed is going to be occupied by these carrots. These carrots will be the next crop to come into this bed. And what you hope is that crop is a crop that is going to benefit perhaps from the previous crop being in that bed, but certainly not be a crop that is going to have a hard time growing in a bed previously occupied by crop number one. So you wouldn't want to follow a crop like radish with a crop like arugula, because they're both in the brassica family and they share certain pests and disease, namely flea beetles in my region in the Northeast. So you don't want to follow crops that with other crops from the same family, for instance. That's often a no-no. But there's other things to consider. So, what type of seed bed does the crop need? Carrots need a very fine seed bed. They need to have really good tilth in the soil because they're a small seed, and they need to be able to germinate over a period of 7 to 14 days with adequate soil moisture. So you don't want a choppy, debris-filled seed bed in order to plant carrots. They're not going to handle that sort of situation very well. So you might want to follow a crop like lettuce that doesn't create a lot of debris with a crop like carrots that doesn't deal well with debris. This is just a general crop rotation example, but within this example, that is a specific reason why this would work. There are many ways to, slice the carrot, so to speak, when designing your crop rotation. Namely, it has to do with the crops that you actually want to grow, and then finding ways that they work together by understanding them. So often what you'll do is you'll list your crops in an Excel column over here, and then over here, you're going to need to list the fertility needs of those crops, whether or not they need a fine seed bed, whether or not they create a lot of debris or trash at the end of the season, whether or not they have high, medium, or low fertility needs. You need to really understand the growth pattern and the needs of all your crops in order to create a good crop rotation. So what will happen here is in bed number one, you'll just keep moving the crops into it. In this example, we actually have 9 crops in the rotation. And this could be seen as 9 crops that move into bed one over the course of 9 years. But also, this is a general crop rotation. And what about understanding this differently and saying, well, actually, I actually succession my garden several times a year. So in this case, what happens is bed number one is occupied by a crop in spring, and then it's occupied by a crop in fall. So maybe this is spring lettuce followed by fall carrots. And then, in year 3, it's followed by these cantaloupe down here, for instance. So there's a lot of different ways to do this rotation, and there's a lot of things to consider, but the principles remain the same. You could even get 3 crops in a rotation. And in fact, even in northern climates, when you maximize things like transplanting and season extension techniques like row cover, and really good methods of efficiently getting crops into the ground and using crops that have a low DTM or days to maturity, you can certainly get 2, 3, and even 4 croppings in your garden every year. And so sometimes you want this to be maxed out. Sometimes you want to include cover crops in that mix. Sometimes you want to leave periods of fallow where you might cover it with weed barrier or cultivate it in order to get rid of a weed, or you might want to just be adding fertility and having a regenerative phase with fertility and cover cropping. So all of that has to be considered within your crop rotation. Your crop rotation has to consider cover crops and other procedures that are needed as part of your equipment task schedule, which is another topic for another lecture. But I want you to kind of have that in your mind as you look at the general crop rotation is, one, how many crops am I going to grow? How many years until that bed number one returns to being planted in lettuce? How many of these slots are actually done in the same year? And do I have an Excel file where I actually write down all the characteristics of my crop so that I can plan appropriately with those needs in mind? But as a rule of thumb, I want the crop that is in a bed in year 1 to make that bed a better situation for the crop that occupies it in year 2. And the crop that's coming into that bed, I want to consider how it's going to be able to use the benefits that are left. So has that crop left a lot of debris? Which crops can handle that type of debris, such as a larger crop like potatoes or even transplants of squash, where it's very few large plants that are placed into a bed and can be planted into a debris-rich scenario. An example of that is how I often manage for squash transplants is I will grow a crop of peppers or eggplant or brassicas like broccoli, which have a lot of debris they leave and roots that are very hard to deal with. And I'll flail mow the tops of those down. I will leave the roots in the ground, and then I will tuck weed barrier up over top of those roots and just leave a little slit in the center row. And then I'll come through the next year and I'll transplant my squash into that center row. You can even furrow down that middle row because there are no roots in that middle row, which this is one of the benefits of 1-2-3 planting, which we talk about in another lecture. But this is how you're able to leave that debris in situ, and understanding that in this crop rotation example, we're allowing the debris to be a fertility source and allowing it to stay in the ground, because we're not rotating another brassica in that's going to have a pest problem from that debris. And we're not rotating in a crop like, lettuce or carrots that's going to need a really nice fine tilth to actually seed. You could not seed a row of carrots into a bunch of, debris-rich, broccoli debris-rich roots in the ground sort of bed situation in the next year after growing a crop of broccoli. So this is an example where you're dealing with that debris. So this is how we build out crop rotations overall. So that is that, and we'll see you for another lecture next time.